Good afternoon and welcome. I apologize for the technical delay. We're still working with finding the right computer for the PowerPoints, but the presenters who are doing those will go towards the end of the event. So let me begin by welcoming you. Thanking you for coming. This is the fourth in a series of humanities panels that began a year ago in the spring with English, continued in the fall with philosophy and modern languages, and will end in next fall with religious studies. The idea behind these panels was to offer students, graduates and undergraduates, a glimpse at some of the research that faculty in your department is doing, and get a chance to see the relationship between that research and classroom instruction, which I think is a very important conjunction. It is the reason that we're here. There wouldn't be a reason to do research if it didn't impact the classroom, but often the connection is not always clear for a number of reasons, and so I welcome this opportunity. I'm very, very grateful to four members of the history department for coming to present to you their work and show how it does connect to what goes on in the classroom. We're going to change. We were originally going to follow the order of speakers on as they appear on the poster because of our search for a computer for a laptop that actually works. We're going to change it a little bit. Let me introduce the four speakers now. They will present, and then afterwards there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. The first speaker will be Professor Aurora Moreo, whose work focuses on gender, religion, sexual politics in modern Spain. She'll be discussing material from her most recent book, En Cuerpo y Alma, Ser Mujer en Tiempo de Franco, Body and Soul, to be a woman in the time of Franco. Next, Professor Gwen Davis, who specializes in ancient history and culture, and as a trained and working archaeologist, brings, I think, a very unique and important perspective to those topics. We'll talk about his research focusing on Roman siege operations. The third speaker is Professor April Merlot, whose interests lie in political economy and cultural studies, and she will be discussing material from her recently published book, Sugar and Civilization. And finally, Professor Victor Uribe will be the second speaker. Has a joint appointment in history and the School of Law. He's the author of over 20 books and 60 articles, and we'll be discussing material from his latest book on spousal murder in the Spanish colonial territories. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Aurora Moreo.
Thank you. Can I stay here, or do I go to the
Could you go to the podium?
Sure.
Because we're being recorded. So I neglected to mention that all of the center events are video recorded. If you would like to relive the highlights of today or any others, just go to humanities.fiu.com/archives, and it's there. And you're more than welcome to use any of the material there for your own classes.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. We have very little time so that all of us have a chance to tell you a little bit about our research, and I am so honored to be in the company of my colleagues this afternoon. It's very unusual that we listen to each other's research, so this is a wonderful opportunity. I don't think I have spoken about my research to the department and my colleagues since I was interviewed in 2002, so it's probably about time that I say something about what I've been doing, because people might think that, I'm faking it through the years. But I'm going to talk about this baby. I call my books pregnancies of my brain, and they're my babies, and this is kind of a fat baby. It's the result of 26 years of research that I have developed since I moved to the United States in 1989. It's being published. It's called El Cuerpo y Alma, Ser Mujer en Tiempos de Franco, and it's the fusion of the first two books that I wrote. One was my dissertation, True Catholic Womanhood, Gender Ideology in Franco's Spain, and the second one was The Seduction of Modern Spain, the Female Body and the Francoist Body Politics. And so in this book, I had to somehow figure out what was the thread running through and making sense of these two different books and different arguments. And that's why I'm trying to combine in it both el cuerpo, the female body, as a symbolic representation of the body politics, and the alma, or the spirit, the identity of the true Catholic woman that I explored in the first book. And I decided that what was running through it was the religious element that is what the Franco's regime is going to use to solidify and legitimize itself in power. And that it was actually the Baroque period and the Counter-Reformation that helped shape and inform the legal system, the social system, the popular culture in Spain. So what I tried to demonstrate in this book is that the ideological nature of the Franco's regime, when you do a feminist gender analysis of this totalitarian regime that was propped up in the second half of the 20th century by the international politics of the Cold War, was a sort of neo-Baroque nature. And in that sense, I use the work of a scholar called José Antonio Marabal that wrote about la cultura del barroco. And I found that there were a lot of similarities between the characterization of the Baroque as a period in which you have to deal with popular mass culture. You have a sense of a political body that one of the encyclicals that I analyzed by Pius XII is called the mystic body of Christ, and actually José Antonio Marabal talks about the mystic body politic of the Franco's regime. So little by little I saw how the body politics of the regime was informed by national Catholicism and how this Counter-Reformation and neo-Baroque quality was permeating everything. For example, you're gonna have the regime actually be very clear about you redeem your debt to the state through working in, the Valle de los Caídos. You're gonna have after the war la redención por el trabajo. This idea of redemption is part of that Catholic, those Catholic values. So, in reality, the book is dealing with both official documents, the legal documents that the regime produces, and I do text analysis of those laws. I analyze also encyclicals produced by the Vatican regulating family relations and educational relations and so forth. And then I move to the study of the popular culture. I look at cinema, censorship, I look at literature also, and I introduce oral histories as well. So the archive for me is not just the archive where you find documents strictly historically conceptualized, but my approach is more of a cultural approach in which I do like an archaeological, scanning of the environment as well. Objects, oral history is very important. So my engagement with oral histories with the dictatorship also has led me to be interested in memory and historical reconciliation. And so the work that I'm doing now is actually writing about some of the oral histories that I did and never made them to these books that I started in the mid-80s until the mid-2000s. And so I have two sets of women's interviews, some that were at the university in the university resistance and some that were just working class women. And I'm trying to look at it from a perspective of memory studies and trying to do some theoretical analysis of the word and poetics of history and so forth. It's very esoteric and it's still very early, so I won't tell you very much about it. But in reality, all those different books and research have been always helping me create my classes and teach my classes. I have taught a class that is been very successful, the cultural history of the body, that actually helped me articulate the whole narrative and methodology for the second book. I have taught a class on memory and historical reconciliation that allows me to investigate more about this area of research. And I feel that when I bring my questions and my readings and my doubts to the classroom, I can have the graduate students as the sounding board that kind of tell me you are absolutely crazy, or they tell me, that's interesting, or whatever. So that's it. I'm making the Nancy lecture.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, a disclaimer, I have not published 20 books, as Michael said. I would have been very proud if that was the case. The law school builds resumes by saying he has published 20 books and chapters. So obviously it looks better, books and chapters, but this is something that you will realize if you look at any of the resumes in the College of Law. I have hardly managed to publish 2 original monographs, 2 edited volumes, and a translation. But again, this is just so that you don't be too proud of me. As opposed of what happens to me, I am really very proud of you. And actually, I wanted to start by saying that it probably is not easy for the Center for the Humanities in an urban environment directed by Professor Gillespie to invite a department that has published 4 original monographs in a single academic year, as is the case with the Department of History. This is fairly unusual, and it's even more unusual that all of these monographs have been published by some of the most distinguished presses in the field. Siglo XXI, the book, the press that published Aurora Morcillo's book is perhaps one of the most, if not the most distinguished press in the Spanish world. North Carolina University Press goes without saying is a most distinguished press. Aislinn Brown's is a very important press in fields like archaeology, and I think Stanford University Press is another very good press. So I have to start by saying that I'm very proud of my colleagues, I'm very proud of my department, I'm very proud of the productivity that this reflects. I wish I could also say I'm proud of the many undergraduate students who are listening to this, and I am proud of the interdisciplinary nature of the audience. Unfortunately, I don't know if it is only the case in FIU. sometimes it's hard to get the type of audiences that you would aspire to speak to. I think it would be very important for undergraduates to actually listen to a conversation such as this, because after all, part of what we want to do is to have an impact on our majors. But again, it's not possible. And it would be also interesting to engage in an interdisciplinary dialogue and have some philosophers and economists and language or literature experts. But again, it's complicated. Probably it has to do with the schedules. I don't really know what is going on, but I hope we can, at FIU, reflect more on how to inspire and incentivize participation in this type of events, because once more, I do think that there is much to learn from this type of presentation. What I had originally done is that I was trying to describe this book at a relatively basic level, precisely thinking that there would be some undergraduates in the audience, and it so happens that this is an audience of professional historians, so I will see if I can elevate a little bit the level of the conversation. But I do wish to start by describing some of the basic themes or aspects of my work, and there are really three that are central. One of them is crime, the other one is law, and the third one is punishment. Those three are central processes, historical processes that I am interested in understanding. In the case of crime, I am obviously particularly involved in trying to make sense of crimes that involve a gender dimension, that involve aggression of men against women and women against men, both of whom are involved in a sentimental relationship of some kind, in a familial relationship of some kind. So again, crimes involving members of families are central to my research. And this means that my research relies heavily on criminal records. That is to say, most of my empirical evidence comes from criminal trials that are unearthed in archives in several locations, and that are basically compilations of the proceedings involving the accusation, involving the testimony of those accused of committing a crime, involving the participation of witnesses, involving files presented by attorneys, whether prosecutors or whether defense attorneys. So basically a thick, in many instances, in other instances a thin, record of the criminal proceedings. As for law, the legal component, I approached it not only through legal statutes, compilations of laws contemporary to the events, but also through something that called deeply my attention, which were a series of practical legal manuals in the Spanish realms from very early on, as early as the late 16th century. There started to circulate a number of hands-on manuals to guide practitioners, legal practitioners, attorneys, or public defenders, or judges, or even lay people who were interested in learning about how legal cases were handled. And I paid close attention to dozens of these legal manuals, and in fact, I ended up building an argument about access to justice through these legal manuals, because my sense is that even again, lay people could know how to approach the courts, how to litigate, and were relatively familiar with some of the technicalities of legal cases. Then the third aspect, punishment, was all something that actually took a central place in my research as time evolved. I never imagined I was going to be writing a monograph where punishment was going to become so central. In fact, it became the most central aspect. And this also I managed to learn about it through criminal records, and in some cases through newspapers and memoirs that described in detail how some people were paraded as they were marching to their executions, or as they were marching through the streets and being exposed to public view because of this dishonorable nature of the behaviors that they had incurred in. So these are three central themes that I addressed. Then I wanted to say something quickly about the methodology or methodological principles that guided me in this research. One initial one that is quite important to me is abundant empirical evidence, even though the humanities are considered to be highly speculative or critical disciplines, unlike the social sciences or the natural sciences or the physical sciences. The reality is that disciplines such as history, and you will appreciate that in every one of these books, particularly perhaps more in any one, in the case of Professor Davis' book than in any other one, you will realize that we rely on very serious bodies of empirical evidence, and in my case, this to me has always been a central principle of my research. In fact, if anything, I make the mistake of telling myself and my students that once you have control over the empirical evidence, the rest can be relatively easy to handle. That is to say, I say it this way, theory to me, I have to confess, is icing on the cake. To me, really, what matters most and what drives my search is empirical evidence. And I think this is something that we can discuss because it's a very controversial statement, but I stand by my word. I put together a database comprised of 200 cases that I gathered in numerous archives in Spain, in Mexico, and in Colombia are the 3 cases that I consider. So again, abundant empirical evidence to me is a must. Then a second must for me is also an effort to quantify things. Even if quantification, as is my case, is a low-level type of quantification. I didn't run regression analysis, I didn't run sophisticated statistics. I was told, why don't you do that in order to be more convincing? And I just felt that I don't appreciate some of those books that try to run these sophisticated statistical tests with evidence that I don't think is hard enough to run those type of tests. But again, sometimes people are very impressed when you see regressions, and as is the case of actually a very famous book in my field by University of Wisconsin professor Steve Stern, who see all kinds of statistical tables, but he's dealing with a few dozen cases, and I don't think that really makes sense. But in any case, I do make an effort to quantify, and you will find throughout my book a series of particular cross-tabulations that address statistically where the cases occur, how weapons appear, what the gender of participants is, what motivations seem to be, and so on and so forth. And I try to measure this as systematically and as consistently across the 3 cases as I was able to do. Then there is the comparative element of my work. This is a comparative history. This is a book that requires me to compare and contrast behaviors in 3 different locales, in 3 different regions, and I try to do my best at identifying particularities or similarities across the 3 cases. And again, this is sometimes painstaking and tentative, while comparative history and comparative historical methodologies are central to my work. Another aspect that I try to highlight, although I don't think I am as thorough about this one as I am about the rest, is the interconnectedness of events. I do think that fragmenting society into discrete compartments doesn't allow you to view the complexity of the human experience and social change. And therefore, I try to address cultural aspects, social aspects, legal aspects, material aspects, because I do believe that they are all somehow interwoven and central to making sense of the complexity of the historical experience. And a final methodological principle that I try to pay close attention to was what I borrow in the expression of Peter Spierenburg, a very distinguished historian of murder and violence, is referred to as developmentalism. And by developmentalism, what Spierenburg means is the sense that historical change doesn't take place abruptly or overnight, but over long periods of time. So that this is gradual and actually cumulative, and that to make sense of things such as changes in punishment, you will have to look at, again, long periods of time rather than revolutionary periods. And therefore, ultimately, this makes me revise some of the observations of Michel Foucault about the nature of the evolution of punishment, because Foucault's position is a little more of the type of abrupt change brings about through revolutionary transformations, dramatic shifts in the way, in this case, punishment was applied. Now, historiographically, what I try to do refers to a number of historiographies. It's really hard to summarize a single body of historiographies, but I will try to quickly go over a number of them as efficiently as possible. I obviously address issues having to do with the history of gender, and particularly with the operation of patriarchal relations. And what I do is not revisionist, is just a confirmation of what we already know, and is Hispanic societies in colonial times, in ancient regime times, and also in the early modern days were deeply patriarchal. But that didn't mean that women were powerless. On the contrary, part of what I also confirm is that women were agents of their own lives and their own history, and that their behavior, if anything, demonstrates their active participation not only in private life but also in public life. So I, in a way, confirm and endorse the views of many other historians who over the years have already documented, again, the active participation of women in historical change, and in this particular instance, in public life, because there is been the sense that women were active in private spaces, but not in the public sphere. And if anything, part of what I say is many of the conflicts that occur and that resulted in the killing of women had a lot to do with the fact that women transcended private spaces, were active in the open space, in the public space, and these alienated their mates, and because of this, and the sense that they were lacking control or losing control over their wives, they ended up sometimes answering back through violence. So again, this in the realm of gender. As for ethnicity, which is another very important category to me, because many of these cases involve the participation of members of indigenous communities, something that was central to me was to understand the nature of the treatment of Indian criminals, whether male or female. And what I end up documenting, and this actually corresponds to, again, developmentalism, long change over time, has a lot to do with the use of a notion that was central to the legal systems of actually civil law systems, both in Europe and in this case in Spanish America. And it's a category that is referred to as miserabilis persona. It's a Roman law category, the category of the miserable ones or the wretched ones. Indians were addressed in the criminal cases as miserable peoples, but it's not because they were poor. It's because they were, as many other members of society, were vulnerable. Widows were vulnerable. Infants were vulnerable. Indians were vulnerable. And their vulnerability created a series of situations whereby they were treated in a very differential way. So many of these Indian criminals, what you learn through these cases, were pardoned. So blank pardons were extended to many of these individuals. And again, this had to do with their miserable nature, but I deconstructively with the category of miserableness or wretchedness to demonstrate that it was a complex technical legal category that came from Roman law and canon law, and that evolved over time and was applied in Spanish America in a particular way that benefited, again, Indian criminals. Then I also address another historiography that concerns the culture of honor. And the culture of honor was central because, as you have imagined, perhaps, in many instances, what is at stake when there is domestic violence is the sense that women, in particular, are behaving in dishonorable ways, or are not upholding the honor that is due to the head of the household or to the family in general. And if anything, what I demonstrate is that, again, honor was open-ended in many of these cases, because most cases did not involve husbands who killed unfaithful wives. actually many of them were quite the opposite. It's unfaithful wives who with their lovers kill their husbands in order to get rid of them and to run away with lovers. So again, the operation of the culture of honor is a little trickier than one would have imagined, because once more, the sense is that Mediterranean cultures are driven by these hot-tempered behaviors on the part of patriarchs, and this again doesn't quite click, doesn't correspond, and therefore I enter into a dialogue with this type of literature. And finally, another series of historiographies I enter into conversation with are the historiographies concerning punishment. And in this case, that, as I mentioned, became central over time. My conversation is fundamentally with Michel Foucault, and my position ends up being an endorsement of the views of two other prominent academics. One of them I already mentioned, Pieter Spierenburg, who we brought here and was in this room addressing as giving a talk that wasn't what many of us expected, but in any case, Pieter Spierenburg is a highly distinguished historian who sides with another highly distinguished academic, who is Norbert Elias. And Norbert Elias, who wrote a masterful series of works, particularly the civilizing process. Both Spierenburg and Elias are of the opinion that the change in the, particularly in the case of punishment, was not as abrupt as Foucault would have us believe, but was actually much more long-term and gradual. And part of what I document is that there was indeed a process of civilization of punishment that I choose to call, Spierenburg doesn't like this type of terminology, but I choose to call humanization of punishment, because humanity and the humanization of treatment of criminals is mentioned in the primary sources. And what I try to say and document is that the humanization of punishment started back in medieval times, and actually there are very interesting cases and evidence for the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. So it's nothing that happened abruptly in the late 18th century and early 19th century. It's something more long-term, and we could speak about this more at length if there are questions about this. Then I was going to say something more, but I think I ran out of time, about the challenges of writing what in my case is a second book. And I wanted to address epistemological challenges in my case, using a category of analysis such as gender. My earlier research didn't really address gender in a central manner, so I have to learn a great deal, and I don't know if I learned what I have to learn. That is something that we'll have to wait and see what the reviewers say, and I'm sure that some of the reviewers might not be happy with my analysis of gender, but again, I try to do my best. Another innovation in my case is the use of the comparative method. I always wanted to write a comparative book, and I went for it, and it's very challenging. It's not the easiest modality of history. I don't encourage anyone to embark upon comparative history. It's really a pain in the neck. But in any case, those were epistemological challenges that we could address more length. And then there are a number of practical or existential challenges that have to do with the solitude and a different level of pressure that you feel when you're writing a second book, or that have to do with the increasing service, administrative, family commitments. When you are writing a second book, you already have kids that are running around the house and that you have to take to school, or you have to be GPD, or you have to be chair, or you have to be this, or you have to be that. And that also has an impact, and you have to pay a toll for that. Then in my case, stop and go didn't help either, because I had to write this over many years with lots of interruptions, with commitments of all kinds. The expectation of producing a better book than your first book is not an easy one to always handle, because you already have to kind of demonstrate that the first one wasn't a flash in the pan, that you have something important to say, and it's not always easy. The agony over the lapse of time, the non-native language in my case is also one. And then I leave it at this because I wanted to say something of pedagogy and the way I use literal history, or the history of women, or the history of the age of revolution in my classes, but I don't want to take more time than I have already taken. Thank you very much.
Let's see if I can carry this over to the lectern without disrupting everything.
No.
Yeah, no, I can do it from here. I'm sure you can adjust the perfect. we've had enough technological challenges as it is. So I wish Victor hadn't brought up Professor Spiritberg, because I remember that all too well, and that's rather thrown me. But anyway, that's another subject we won't get there. So from each summer from 2003 to 2007, in conjunction with my co-director, Jodie Magnus of UNC Chapel Hill, I conducted excavations at the late Roman fort site at Yotvata in Israel's Arava Valley, in the lower Arava, about 50 kilometers north of the Red Sea at Eilat Aqaba. It's a pretty unforgiving environment. The fort is situated at a natural constriction in the valley, where the hills from the west come down. Perhaps the valley is about 5-6 kilometers across at this point. Directly south of the site are very extensive salt pans, so it is a natural choke point in the valley. And more importantly, this is a permanent water source, which of course is extremely significant in an extreme desert environment like this. The fort itself is a quadribergium, which is a modern coined term for a class of fortification, a very small class of fortification, square-shaped with projecting corner towers. Effectively, this is the plan of the fort, showing the excavated areas. Unfortunately, in the 50s, the Israelis pushed an oil pipe line straight through the middle of it, causing enormous damage, swath of destruction across the middle of the site. So we can't excavate anything in the middle because the archaeology is gone. Now, Yotvata, the publication came out in this rather handsome Imperial Purple and Gold book. I prefer Imperial Purple to the publisher's rather more mundane aubergine. But Tyrian Purple is what I would call it. But anyway, so the excavation is the only way that we can actually acquire any information when it comes to the fort in Yotvata, because the fort makes no appearance in the literary record at all. There are no references to the fort, its garrison, chronology, anything. So without archaeology, we wouldn't know anything about it. Right? So if you are to actually discover something about the nature of the garrison, perhaps make some interpretation as to purpose and significance, certainly to derive a chronology, you have to dig the site, because otherwise it's a total blank. Now, there are obviously direct pedagogical benefits to an archaeological excavation when they're ongoing. We take volunteers, we take mostly students from universities across the world, but particularly in the US, and they get schooled in archaeological field techniques. They get told how to trowel properly, how to keep a site nice and clean. Archaeologists are obsessive about keeping their sites clean. That's why their houses are so filthy. Because you spend all your energies making your site pristine, and you really can't be bothered with your living room. So, they get taught how to dig properly, how to dig systematically. Here's a volunteer excavating an oil lamp, which is sitting right on top of the earliest Roman floor surface, which is a little patch of white plaster off to the right of the oil lamp. These aren't mosaic floors, they're concrete floors. These are dirt floors flecked with lime plaster, so they're pretty tenuous. People get taught recording techniques. Everything has to be recorded. Archaeology is a destructive discipline. As we go down, we're removing evidence. So you have to record everything as you're going along. So, okay, my co-director and I were interested in the late Roman period, but this doesn't mean that at subsequent periods we can just plow through. Some other people are going to be interested in that material. There's a British mandatory period police station on the site, so we had to excavate a section of that from the 1930s and record it as we went. And then going down, we removed that. There was an early Islamic farmstead dating to the 7th, 8th centuries that we had to record and remove before we get down to the late Roman levels. No one can go back and do that again. That information has gone forever. I mean, we've excavated down 2 meters. That information has been destroyed. So unless we record it, unless we publish what we've recorded, then that information is lost forever. So there's a very real crisis in archaeology when it comes to publication, because there's a far too cavalier attitude about people in digging places without actually publishing their results. And from the, not to say that we were, of course we did a particularly fine excavation, of course we did, but to actually, the process of producing the final dig report in this monograph was demonstrated to me the impossibility of attempting to reconstruct someone else's excavations. There's lots of money out there to go back and publish the reports of excavations that were never published originally back from the 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. But these are exercises in fantasy, because it doesn't matter how detailed someone else's excavation notes are. I think it would be extremely challenging, at the very least, to actually get a very realistic picture of what was going on working from someone else's notes. It was challenging enough working from my own notes. That was, so I think that these large grants out there for publishing Leonard Woolley's excavations at some dramatic site in Babylonia, I mean, they're an exercise in fantasy, I'm afraid. Perhaps it's better than nothing, but nonetheless. So, further techniques, drawing, etc., so people can come up and make plans, make section drawings, stratigraphy as you're going along. All these techniques are all taught in the field. Now, the point of this excavation, in a sense, we go into a dig with an objective in mind. We wanted to study the late Roman phase. We wanted to study the role of the army in the 4th century, which is the phase of occupation here at Yogyakarta. You have this as an overarching objective. You want to know something about the composition of the garrison, what the people are doing, what their subsistence regiments were like, what role they played in the regional economy, etc., etc. Now, you don't know what you're going to find until you start digging. Now, the site had always been assumed to have been set up because of this building inscription under Diocletian at the very end of the 3rd century. This was an inscription that was originally above the east gate to the fort, and it commemorates the construction of the fort under the governor of Palestina, a guy called Priscus, who we know from other inscriptions from the provincial capital of Caesarea to have been governor around about 292 to 296. So this would give us a date for the foundation of the fort, this inscription. And it's a very interesting inscription in many ways. We won't talk about that really today. But that's the sort of starting point for our fort. The problem is that when we were actually digging the fort, on the lowest Roman ground surfaces, there were 3 or 4 dirt floors, one on top of the other, at the very bottom one, so the very first floor to be put in, directly above the levelling course on which the fort was constructed, we were finding coins that dated to the mid-4th century. So which, using normal archaeological principles of superimposition and stratigraphy, one would say that that first floor was built, can be dated by reference to the latest coins on it. That is to say, the mid-4th century. In other words, 50 years after this inscription would seem to indicate. And we published this. In 2011, we published an article saying that Yogyakarta was a Valentinianic foundation, not Diocletianic at all. Fortunately, before the book came out, we had to recant this opinion because an identical inscription was found 30 kilometers away, about 30 kilometers away, across the valley in Jordan at a site called Garandal. exactly the same inscription. And it beggars belief that the two sites right next door to each other in a sort of military system with the same sort of building inscription were not contemporary. So what we're faced with at Yogyakarta is a rather inexplicable phenomenon of later coins on the earliest floors. And we don't really have a proper explanation for this, other than perhaps hypothesizing a super enthusiastic later fort commander digging out all the floor surfaces and relaying them in the mid-4th century. Now what we have to try and do is then relate what we know from the archaeology to the historical record. And the first phase at Yogyakarta is characterized, first floor is covered in a very thick layer of burning. Across all the internal buildings in the fort were burnt at the end of the first phase, which indicates a very serious fire at the fort. Now, it's likely, given that the main gate was broken in, we have the nails from the main gate from this first phase lying in nice neat rows in the entrance corridor, that the fort was subject to attack and was destroyed by hostile action. The only context that we could possibly put this into, given that perhaps this first phase is related to the mid-4th century, is a revolt of a Bedouin queen, Queen Mavia, whose Sozomon and the church fathers, various church father sources, Eusebius, talk about attacking Roman installations in southern Palestina and on the approaches to Egypt. So this would be, in fact, the first attested archaeological evidence for the revolt of Queen Mavia. She had Roman foederati, that is to say, former auxiliaries of the Roman army in her military, and so they were entirely capable of taking a small fort like Yogyakarta. We're left with various mysteries. We're never going to work out exactly what happened in all places. We have this one of the more interesting rooms of the fort. This sort of, should we call it an altar? Podium, anyway, inserted against the back of the main wall of the fort. We can't excavate any further towards me here because the building of the British Mandatory Police Station is there, so we undermine it, so it has to be left in situ. But it's a building inside an internal room with this podium at the end of it, with two benches. We can see at the bottom of the shot, on either side of the room, the bases of two benches. It's very likely that this had some sort of cultic purpose, something that is made even more likely by the insertion in the second phase of a niche into the wall of the fort. They dig out a semicircular apse into the wall of the fort. This is, it'd be nice to say it's an early Christian chapel inserted into the fort, which, if this is into the later second half of the 4th century, is indeed very likely, but it also could represent, perhaps in the earliest phase, the place where the unit standards were being kept. Finally, the end of the fort, we know from all the bottom phase, or the top Roman floor surface that was cleaned out. There were virtually no artifacts whatsoever from the uppermost Roman fort. It was an orderly abandonment. The place was cleaned out very thoroughly before the Romans left, and then the place was simply left to the desert. What I've highlighted here is evidence for tectonic activity. This is an internal mud brick wall that has toppled over in one catastrophic event, and we have geomorphological evidence for earthquakes and attested in historical record for the area. And it's likely then that this was an earthquake, the earthquake of 417, which toppled this particular wall. So that would give us a sort of a terminus by which time the fort had been abandoned, because beneath that topple there was clean wind-blown sand, so it had been abandoned for some time before that internal wall came down. But also tellingly, in our one evidence, a piece of literary evidence, is evidence of absence. There is a document that details the troop garrisons of the East across the empire, but one of the folios of it in the Notitia Dignitatum dated to about 400 AD, which is like an administrative flow chart that tells us which garrisons belong to which provincial governors, the reporting chains of a Roman military administrative network. Jotveter is not mentioned in that document. All the other forts in the area are mentioned with their garrisons noted in this flow chart. The fact that Jotveter isn't in the document suggests that by 400 it had been abandoned, so quite a bit before this earthquake. So these gives the intersection, crucial intersection here is taking what we know, the historical sources such as they are, and trying to fit our archaeological material into that context to create a narrative. And that, in a sense, is the real pedagogical value of something, a report of this nature. It shows the process in action. Anyone can go back. You don't have to agree with our interpretations. We have a section here on the interpretations of the data. All the data is in the report. If you were so minded, you can go back, you can look at our excavation reports of various areas. We tell you the sequences, we tell you what we find. You can go back and reinterpret it if you so desire. We're not saying this is the definitive answer. We're offering this as a possible interpretation of what's happening at Jotveter. And we have contributions from various specialists who are helping us. This is, in a sense, is not an edited volume. The difference between this and an edited volume is that these guys are producing their reports based on data that we produce, using the chronologies that we establish, and we supervise very carefully pretty much all of the argumentation deployed in their reports. So, although it seems to be like an edited volume with contributions by someone on the pottery and someone on the glass and someone on the faunal remains, etc., etc., it's a much more hands-on from the authors or the editors, if you like, than it would normally be the case in an edited volume. So it's entirely fallacious to characterize a sort of archaeological report of this nature as an edited volume, for example. I think we leave it at that.
Yeah, or something like that. What time do we have until? Oh, we have until 5? I don't know if anybody else wishes that. So I had a PowerPoint, but it was on the other computer, and so I think I'm not going to take the time to try to transfer that. So I'm just going to talk, and some of you have heard this talk before, or a version of it, and some of you have heard it twice. So if you get up and leave, I will forgive you. A few of you haven't heard it. So I'm going to talk about my book, which is now out, Sugar and Civilization, American Empire and the Cultural Politics of Sweetness. I would normally show you a slide of the cover. This is not the cover of the book. I'm going to give you an overview of the book, and I'll just talk a little bit about how it relates to teaching, and mostly that just has to do with the topics of the courses that I teach. So Sugar and Civilization tells the story of sugar from the Spanish-American War of 1898 through the beginning of World War II, really 1939-1940, and through the New Deal of the 1930s. So I researched workers and consumers and policymakers in a variety of different locations in order to uncover how there came to be a very large supply of sugar, and Victor likes charts. You would see a chart here showing the rise in sugar availability. Data there, so how people came to have access to and then consume ever-growing quantities of sugar in the first decades of the 20th century. So I argue overall that the cultural logic that connected imperial trade and immigration policies was the same one that facilitated new habits of sugar consumption within the United States and its territories. So between the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the beginning of World War II, the meanings of sugar consumption changed alongside debates about political and economic status of the territories within the United States and a variety of different groups of people within the United States. And I want to actually just pause here and talk a little bit about sources and methodology, partly because it was so interesting for me to hear my colleagues talking about their approaches. It made me wish that we did actually a lot more of this, because I realized that there are some really interesting commonalities in our approaches. So I make this argument that there's a cultural logic connecting policy on the one hand and the sort of social and cultural practices of sugar consumption on the other. And so this question of how do I actually do that? I do that in part by doing a close textual reading, doing a cultural analysis of political texts, right? So sources, political sources that people might use for a more straight political economy. I read those as cultural texts. I also, as Dr. Morcio pointed out about her research, I do a similar kind of thing of casting a wide net to find as many kinds of sources as I can that make reference to sugar, right? And so I look at all kinds of different things and then ask what those things have to do with each other. And so I try to find the juxtapositions between sources that might seem unrelated and then ask actually what ties those things together. And I adhere very closely to chronology. And I would say that's part of what allows this method to work, is that I maintain a very close attention to both the chronology, the location, and the sort of social, gender, racial, ethnic identifications of the people who are creating the sources, articulating these ideas, and eating the sugar. So I am particularly interested in categories of race, which I see showing up most often when people are talking about civilization. And I see a very strong connection between this discourse of civilization and practices of both economic development that led to sugar production and the practices of consumption. So people talk quite a bit about civilized consumption practices and civilized production practices. So just to briefly review sort of what the U.S. empire looks like at this moment, the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898. They retained Puerto Rico and the Philippines following the Spanish-American War of that year, and they occupied Cuba until 1902, 1903, with a few incursions here and there over the next couple of decades, but which was nominally independent under this U.S. protectorate. So sugar could be produced from cane grown on any of those island territories. It could also be produced from sugar beets that were grown on the mainland temperate climates. And if my slides were here, you would have a slide that showed sugar cane and sugar beets, so you can see that they're completely different plants. And even though they're completely different plants, they end up resulting in something that is chemically very similar, right? They both can result in a refined sugar that's very similar. So at the very same time that political leaders, and the general public are debating how to extend U.S. political sovereignty into these new territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific, other people within the government and in the private sector are promoting a domestic sugar beet industry. So one of the things that I track is the extent to which there's a parallel development of the sugar beet industry in the U.S. West, in Michigan, California, Colorado, and other parts of the West, and the island territories, sort of parallel trajectories. And in this sense, my approach is comparative, but it is connected as well, because what I find is that sugar is a thread that links together each of those places. And it is when talking about sugar that policymakers most often make those comparisons between the landscapes, the environment, and the people who are working the land in those places. So policymakers' calculations about the relative merits of cane versus beet sugar and production in tropical versus temperate climates hinged almost always on the racial characteristics of the people who worked the land. together with their assumptions about the natural advantages of the places. So even though in theory the final product, that refined sugar, is chemically indistinguishable, people really made a big deal out of the apparent differences. They tried very hard to distinguish them and to try to articulate what was most civilized and most sort of worthy of public so beet sugar was often portrayed as more civilized, right, as the product of white people in northern white temperate climates, and was contrasted to sugar cane, which was seen as a product of the tropics, an environment that people associated with inferiority, degeneration, indolence, decay, sort of negative connotations. The hope, of course, with U.S. expansion in this period is that white men will take their superior technology, their superior business methods into the tropics, and they will make good on the bounty, the sort of natural bounty that's already there, and so that there is the possibility of this civilizing process. And sugar really is at the forefront of their imagination of how that civilizing process is going to happen, both from the perspective of production and creating productive landscapes, putting people to work in those productive landscapes, and then producing consumers, right? Turning those workers into consumers of those very products. So there's a very close logic to how people, closely connected logic to how they're thinking about people as workers and as consumers. So I call this together so that each of the island territories, Cuba and the sugar beet producing areas, I call that all together the U.S. Sugar Empire. And I assess how popular culture and political policy making shifts within that sugar empire over the course of the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. And overall, I show the diverse ways that many different and new people come to eat greater quantities of sugar and greater quantities of refined sugar. Sugar was cheaper and cheaper, it was integrated into more and more processed foods, and it was integrated into a growing quantity of candy, about which I write several chapters, and distributed through national mass markets. So in the book, one of the questions that I'm really interested in is this question of the consumer cultures of the workers themselves. And I try to follow the diverse consumer cultures of Mexican-American sugar beet workers, Puerto Rican sugarcane workers, Chinese-American workers, native-born workers, African-American workers, and to try to think about what their choices about what kind of sugar and candy to eat have to say about these broader dynamics of colonialism and capitalism in the early 20th century. So what I find is that new meanings for sugar consumption and candy consumption in these years were shaped by and closely related to changing patterns of migration. So both internal migration within the United States from the south to the north, from the east to the west, in circles all around, and also international migration from outside of the United States into the United States. So sugar, and cheap sugar in particular, feeds a growing immigrant and native-born working class at very low cost. So I show the patterns of local and regional businesses that integrate those workers into these mass consumer cultures, sometimes ironically by providing them with non-mass produced sweets, such as piloncillo, which I would show you if I had the slides here, which is an unrefined brown sugar common in rural Mexico. And I tracked a group of merchants, a group of Mexican merchants from the 1910s through the 1930s who imported this unrefined brown sugar into the United States from Mexico in order to sell it to people who had come to the United States to work in sugar beet production. Just sort of ironic turn of events. And so while piloncillo is very cheap in Mexico, it actually becomes very expensive in the United States. And yet people are making the choice to buy this primarily for sort of religious and celebratory reasons. And in part, I argue, to make sense out of their place consumers within this marketplace in which they are at an overall disadvantage. And those ethnic merchants also play a key role in recruiting new workers into the fields, processing remittances that are sent to the home country, and negotiating with U.S. officials. So all in all, I track this commodity through a range of different locations, communities, comparing and contrasting to some extent the ways that this worked out in the process of nation building and empire formation in the first 4 decades of the century. So these are all issues that I bring to my teaching, and I'll just close by saying that. So the questions of food consumption, immigration, consumer culture, political economy, and the politics of expansion and empire are all questions that make their way into my teaching, whether at the undergraduate or graduate level, and those of you who've taken classes with me know this. As well, the methodology of following a single commodity and using that as the lens to make sense out of a complicated and geographically dispersed set of questions is one that those of you who've been in my classes know you get to enjoy repeatedly. And those questions around commodities and the relationship between urban and rural developments are questions that I'm carrying into my second research project, which is about drug commodities and the policies related to those. I'm going to leave it at that so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers.
Thanks to all 4 of our panelists for very, very gripping, graphic descriptions of the work you're doing, and for the grace under pressure that you showed as you had to endure our struggling with technical difficulties and the mistakes I introduced into your introductions because I was too vain to wear glasses when I notes. We do have time for questions now, and I'll ask the 4 of you just to handle them as they come up. So if you have any questions, please present them.
Not everyone at the same time.
Professor for Dr. Daisy, shoot. You had mentioned that there were no references to the port in literature, in any literature at all. So the question was how was it known that it was there? Visible. The other one is, you said the excavations went on from 2003 to 2007. And I always think of like the early 2000s as like technology improving a lot. Was there a difference in the way you were doing things at the end as opposed to the beginning technology?
On the first one, the site is visible as a mound. It was first spotted by Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, when he was doing a survey before World War I. In other words, AKA spying mission. Archaeologists do a lot of that. Did a lot of that because we don't anymore, of course. So it was always visible as a low mound next to the track leading down to Elam. On the second point, that's really probably too short a time frame in which technological differences or changes to manifest themselves. We did experiment with various technologies as we're going along and rejected quite a few of them. But you never excavate a site entirely. There are sufficient areas left. The entire north range of that fort we didn't touch, for example. Other areas of the internal buildings we left. So in the future, with better techniques, people could, if they wanted to, go back and reevaluate the site using those better techniques. And certainly, I mean, that's good practice to do that, for sure.
I have a question for the first speaker, actually. I know that your recent research relies on oral history a lot, and so I'm getting ready to tackle one chapter of my dissertation that almost exclusively tries to reconstruct the history of a company through all the histories. I got about 150 hours of interviews to listen to in the weeks ahead. And I was wondering, so you are like using contemporary witnesses of the 70s and 80s in Spain, and of the 60s. I have observed that the contemporary witnesses are like the stories they tell are very much influenced on their experiences that succeeds the period about which you're talking with them. Like in my case, for instance, was communist Germany, so some of them were treated quite favorably by like the years after 1990. Some weren't. So their histories, oral histories that they have to tell, are very much influenced by that. And it seems to me that I have to kind of peel back layers of presentism in order to get to the heart of what their experiences were at the time. And I was wondering, that's a big question, I realize this, like what methodologies have you discovered or developed to accomplish that? And I would like to emphasize, this is not a question that I'm gonna like put in my methodology chapter. I actually checked out the books, I haven't read them yet, I will. I was just wondering, like pragmatically, like what do you do in order to get to the heart of what these people are talking about when they remember the past?
Well, I guess the question is more of a historiographical nature in terms of what are we after? Are we after meaning, or are we after dry and concrete facts? And I always use the example of Alessandro Portelli and the death of a Turin worker, Trastulli, that you know, he interviewed some people from that strike in Turin, and everybody remembered that he died in 1953. And so when he went to check the death certificate, Trastulli had died in 1948. So something practical is you double check, you know, with documents elsewhere, newspaper, archival materials, to see all the range of information that you have on a particular event. And then what he said is that really there are two times in which this particular historical figure dies. One is his physical death, 1948. The second death is in the imaginary of the community that is telling you the story about labor movement in that space. And so what I'm interested in is not only on what happened, but also how it is remembered. I think that the fact that people are telling you a certain story and they're cleaning up their act a posteriori, particularly when they're coming out of a dictatorship, which is my case and your case, tells you so much about how memory is about and how, you know, certain things are highlighted depending on the context. So, you know, I use theory to analyze these things. I use the work of Roland Barthes and his, you know, approach to what he calls signification. What does it mean? Why is it that these people remember the death in 1953? That is significant to figure out. And it has to do with a series of labor strikes and the death of some people also during that time, later, you know, after 1948. So practically, go check other documents, double check what the official story is, and then, you know, it's like temperatura, la amplitud térmica is neither 72 nor 45 degrees, it's somewhere in between those two where the truth lies. And also I'm very comfortable now after all this time doing research with not getting the absolute truth of anything. So, because everybody's gonna tell you a different story.
All the genders, yeah.
Including, and this is of course a big debate, including when you use hard documents. Those hard documents have authors and mentalities and contexts that were produced to, you know, the Inquisition testimonies were, you know, written in black and white. But that's a debate that we can have as historians as well. I guess I'm from the school of the cynical.
I'll follow up on what you said and what Dr. Uribe put out there regarding empiricists versus theoretical minds. And I guess a concrete question could be, I think that some people are germinating projects, some people are working at a more advanced stage in their project. Could you talk about one or two examples at which point your sources called into question something that you had previously believed to be a crucial part of your argument, or some sort of truth that you had in your head that was going to at least formulate part of what you were gonna say? And then the source, whether it be something you found in the ground or something you found in an archive or something that somebody said, sort of made you say, wait, I have to now change it and I have to adapt what I was thinking or what I was saying. And then if you could if you want to extend that to this empiricist debate, we can. If you want to have some nerdy fun, but.
You're asking me or?
The panel.
So, someone else speak because I'm very cool.
I, for instance, was very interested in a particular modality of punishment that was the punishment for spousal murderers, called encubamiento. Encubamiento consisted of placing the live body of the criminal in a leather sack with a viper, a monkey, a rooster, and a dog, sealing it and dumping it, in
Not just one of them, but all of them?
all of them, and dumping it, sealing it and dumping it in a body of water, typically the ocean or a lake or a river, so that the criminal would disappear from the face of earth, because the act was so despicable that this was not, this individual was not worthy of being buried. Okay? This is a Roman punishment. And then it evolved, and there are many stories about it, but the reason I am mentioning this one in particular is because if I had followed Foucault closely, this would have been an ideal way of characterizing the graphic and physical and painful nature of punishment in many moments throughout history, not just in the, say, the late 18th century. But more important than that, what I started to realize as I went through the archives, I could have been happy with the story because I saw references to many encubamientos, and such person was encubada, and such person was encubada. What I realized as I went through the archives and I started to do more and more cases is that over time this was a total mockery, that the punishment was never really truly implemented the way it was supposed to have been implemented. So instead of using the animals, they painted the animals on the outside of the leather sack. Instead of putting living individuals, they put corpses that they had already killed before. Instead of dumping them permanently into the water so that they could disappear, they just wetted them, and then a religious fraternity took them out and buried them in a religious fashion. All of this contradicted what was supposed to have happened with this punishment. And I started to ask myself, what is going on with punishment in the late 18th century? Why has it taken the turn it has taken? Has it been humanized? When was it humanized? When did they start to, for instance, introduce corpses as opposed to living bodies? So I started to apply these questions to many other methods of burning, for instance. I started to see people were supposed to be killed by burning. They were supposed to be burned at the stake. Then I realized that no, most people were never killed burning. They were already killed. They had already died because they were asphyxiated or they were hung, and then they were burned, but it was a post-mortem ritual. So this is just to say, evidence makes you realize that you have to figure out how to explain complex transformations over time, and that is why I insist so much on paying close attention to evidence. Most historians who would like to use theoretical devices, Foucault, for instance, would be just happy to realize what encubamiento meant in general, and would build from that an entire chapter or an entire book. I just couldn't, in the end, agree with the idea that incubamiento again was what it was supposed to be, and I had to change actually my entire approach to the history of punishment, and that is why, in fact, punishment became so central to my narrative. I ended up being obsessed with explaining the humanization of punishment. How is it that over many centuries, this happened because I started to realize that actually in the 16th century, they already were using corpses, not live bodies. And I started to find, again, these apply to many other areas. So for instance, mutilation. You hear about mutilating bodies. These were corpses. These were not living bodies, as was supposed to have been the case.
So does
So
your
the
manuscript
evidence
begin-
drives you to places where you were not supposed to go. I was never supposed to be addressing these issues.
The manuscript was originally about domestic violence, not about the punishment following, or?
It was about mainly domestic violence, and punishment to me was, yes, a colorful situation that I thought I was going to refer to as a gruesome practice. But again, the gruesomeness of the practice was totally tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Something that was happening also, it was dragging people through the streets. But the dragging became something that they did on top of a mat. Because they sanitized punishment. They it basically lightened up pain. So lightening up pain became a way to do things. Why? Christian sensibility, concerns over not being civilized. So again, these kind of problematize the whole issue of punishment and treatment of prison.
I had said we had till 5, but I was wrong on that too. So we have time for one more question.
Dr. Merlot, you were talking a little bit about your future studies and research on drugs and consumption. And in my comparative government course, one of the countries of study is Mexico. So I was curious if you have any specific plans for focusing on consumption in the U.S. and how it relates to Mexico and the countries that bring things through Mexico, or if you have other ideas.
So what I'm working on now is an environmental history of the war on drugs, and so I'm taking many of the same questions that I'm interested in terms of the production of rural space and the articulation of capitalist power in the countryside, and applying those to questions about how the drug trade was regulated in the United States and Mexico, and Colombia is kind of an open question about whether or not I'm gonna go there or not yet. So I'm really interested in questions of how the transformation of food and farming, or food and forestry markets transform in the international political economy of those products, transform at precisely the moment there's an intensification of counter-narcotics policies. And so those landscapes are transformed then into places where illicit production happens. This is a particular kind of articulation of power there. So in some ways I'm less interested in the questions of consumption, drug consumption, than I am interested in sugar consumption. That said, I will say that there is one connection, and I guess actually in some ways this addresses Dr. Adler's question about the kind of unexpected findings. Maybe this shouldn't have been unexpected, but one of the things I've been doing in the last year is looking into NORML, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Their papers, or papers of one of their, they have a couple of affiliates, but one of the sets of affiliates papers are at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I went through those papers for the 70s and the 80s, looking at how they were actually litigating to try to get the U.S. government to stop supporting chemical eradication of drug crops. And so I was looking at the campaigns that they had around trying to get the government to stop doing that, both in the United States and Mexico. And what I discovered is that that organization the founders of that organization were almost all lawyers, and they were almost all lawyers who came out of the consumer rights movement. So they were all people who came out of the kind of Ralph Nader late 1960s consumer advocacy. And so they're coming at it very much from a consumer perspective. And so they're thinking about exactly these questions of the relationship between producers' health and consumers' health. And so they're saying, well, these herbicides that are being sprayed are both detrimental to the producers and the landscapes where they're being sprayed, but then they're also causing these harms to the people who are smoking the drug. And then what I end up finding is that way of talking about it really starts to fall apart. It falls apart during the Reagan years for a whole variety of reasons, which I'm just trying to sort out now, but that I think actually have to do with these particular ways of talking about bodies and the sort of permeability of bodies to particular kinds of risks. And so I think the choices that people make about using chemicals and using drugs get blurred in this kind of interesting way. And I'm still trying to make my sense out of all of that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but there's some blah about my project.
Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Please join me now in thanking our